Scott just made the point.
Thomas Jefferson, you'll
used to be a lot more secure, not just in our
Hi, everybody. I'm Bill Whittle, and this is part 2 of this week's 3-part trifecta on recovering our lost future. Now, as we outlined in episode 1, that lost future is the idea that certainly people like I grew up with, the kids who grew up in the space age, the idea of a future for America and for the world that was not only going to be something of technological brilliance, not just a world of sort of cool toys to play with and neat cars, a world of abundance, a world of luxury, a world of energy, a world that was going to be clean and fun and cool and shiny, and there wasn't any terrorism and there wasn't any disease and there wasn't any poverty because we had solved most of those problems, and we'd solved most of those problems philosophically. So while we talked about the energy aspect in part 1, in part 2 I want to talk about the morality and the philosophy and sort of the ethics of that lost future to see if we can get any of this back. Well, we still have some people who remembered what that world might have been. So let's bring in our fellow philosophers, Steve Green and Scott Ott, and talk about that sort of missing link in this equation. Steve, let's start with you. You know, that future that we were talking about was not a future of urban decay, and it wasn't a future of ghettos, and it wasn't a future of race wars, and it wasn't a future of anything like that, because primarily, I think, the thing that was most remarkable about that space age vision for America's tomorrow was that it was a world of individuality. It was a world of individuality, and in so many cases, the artwork of Sid Mead that we saw in episode 1 and that we just saw a few moments ago is the artwork of people who are reaping the rewards for their hard work. It was an era when John Kennedy said, "We choose to go to the moon and do the other things not because they are easy, but because they are hard." So, Steve, I want to start with you. I think the one thing that's been stolen from us more than any single thing in terms of the cost of that lost future has been the loss of belief and the loss of teaching and the loss of fundamental understanding and respect for the idea of hard work. And hard work is an individual thing that you do for yourself and your family so that you can gain your own rewards, like this nuclear-powered frickin' RV vehicle that could probably sail across the ocean to Europe if you wanted one. What happened, Steve? What happened to the idea of hard work as a primary virtue here in America?
Well, it still is. Don't undersell the American people. The problem is hard work doesn't pay off the way it should. I read a report in Reason magazine a year or two ago that I wanted to do a trifecta on. I wanted to write a column on the blog, and I couldn't bring myself to do it because the topic was too depressing. The study that this Reason report cited, they went back to 1947, the earliest year from which good records were available, and they estimated that federal regulation chopped 2% off the GDP each and every year. And if you go back to that year, 1947, and you go back and recalculate the compound interest, the compound growth we lost over these 60, 70 years from the 2%, we would have a median income today, a median household, or a median individual income, excuse me, or maybe it was household, I can't remember, of $300,000. Now, we'd still have a poverty rate of $15,000 or $20,000 for a family of 4, but that family of 4 would be making a median income of $300,000. And when a society is that wealthy, you don't worry about how to pay for health care. You don't worry about crowding out the space program. You don't worry about a 12-carrier fleet because you are so busy expanding everywhere into orbit, to the moon, to Mars, because you've got the wherewithal to do it, and you've got the happiness here at home to give you the vision to want to do it. And that's what we've robbed ourselves with this federal behemoth sitting on the economy and squeezing us down from $300,000 per household to maybe 50.
Now, let me ask you a quick follow-up about this.
Yeah.
That lost wealth, that stolen wealth, was based on the amount of federal regulations in 1947 taking 2%, right? I mean, that was, what percentage of the total economy did these federal regulations take today, I wonder?
That's a good question. Maybe they need to redo that study now that it's been a couple, 3 years later.
Or 30%. It's something like that. And of course, not just good for America, because if Americans are that much wealthier, if they're that much wealthier, we're buying things from all around the world. The U.S. money has turned China from a Stone Age country and India from a Stone Age country into wealthy societies because we've bought stuff from them. That's a great point, Steve.
Bingo.
Now, Scott, there was something else about that, the ethics and the morality and the philosophy of that lost future that we are not seeing today that makes the world of today feel like this dystopia, like we need to get on a time machine and shoot a T-Rex back somewhere so that we get back on the timeline we're supposed to have been on, or not shoot one. But here's the thing, Scotty, when you look at what drove the ethics of the space program, it was hard work, as I just mentioned with Steve, but it was also many other qualities. It was discipline, it was study, it was a respect for science and education as actual education, and most of all, it was a sense of internal virtue, like I'm not going to harm other people because I don't need to. My needs are being taken care of. I've got lots of money for charity. My point to you, Scott, is that so many of these values, this idea of discipline, the idea of a tight family, the idea of delayed gratification, were formally provided by religion into the society. And the society of late 50s, early to mid 60s America was far more religious, I think far more virtuous than the society of today. Can we get that back? And if so, do we have to go back to a religion, specifically Christianity, to do it? Or is there another way to replace virtue in today's technological society?
I think in many ways we're victims of our own success in the sense that, for example, in one of these episodes this week, Steve mentions the Hoover Dam and the Tennessee Valley Authority. There was World War II, which was this immense collective effort. There was the NASA space program, which was this immense collective effort that brought in a lot of individuals, a lot of corporations, a lot of government people all together in a common vision. And I think essentially that is not the American way. The American way is much more the Wright brothers in their garage. The American way is much more
Yes.
like Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak in their garage. It's much more like Robert Goddard, who was taking money out of his own paycheck at Clark University or Clark College so that he could buy the gear to try to make a liquid-fueled rocket that he became essentially the grandfather of our space program. That, I think we became deluded by these vast federal programs, and we bought into this idea that somehow government is the director of our national prosperity, when it really isn't that way. I think the future, if you want to look at that, and you can say, is in things like what just happened in the week that we recorded this episode, which is that Jeff Bezos' company has successfully launched and landed a reusable rocket on the Earth. He took it up to like 62 miles, brought it back down, and landed it on its feet, okay? And he's not the only one. Elon Musk's company is trying to do the same thing, actually on a platform in the ocean, and he got really close to that. And so I am so excited about people like this who are getting back to that Wright brothers and Jobs and Wozniak kind of view of what America is all about. We're not looking to the government to launch us into that beautiful future that you've described and that artwork has portrayed. We're looking back to the individual who says, hey, let's do something crazy awesome.
But let me go back to I want to redirect a little bit to the question here, because you're right. The Wright brothers, for example, ran their bicycle shop so they could have the money once a year to go down to North Carolina and build these kites and then throw an engine on it, while Langley got 50 or 100 grand from the government and his aircraft went right into the river. Where do these virtues come from? Because even when you talk about Jeff Bezos and a project that cost maybe $50 million, we're still talking about him spending his own money that he achieved through his own hard work, through his own discipline. On some level, Scott, this kind of sense of we're going to have to discipline ourselves and save our money and not eat the seed corn are kind of farm values as opposed to city values. These values had to come from someplace. Where did they come from, and where do they come from today?
Well, and I did dodge that question, not intentionally. I got so excited about the Wright brothers, but they come from the scriptures. They come from the Old and New Testament, and frankly, here's another area where collectivization has ruined individual morality, because we no longer say you as a person are responsible for the discipline, for the frugality, for the stewardship, for the morality. We look at the culture, and we're always looking at, systematic constraints and aids to morality, instead of saying, hey, Bill Whittle, Steve Green, Scott Ott, what are you doing? How are you behaving? How are you advancing this idea of morality? Because fundamentally, and when you get down to evangelical Christianity and crazy Jesus lovers like me, it is an internal, personal transformation that Jesus does in a man's heart that says, look, I want you, everything you do Work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for men. That's what the scriptures say. And it is that personal commitment to glorifying God in your work that I think has energized even those people who don't believe in Jesus.
Well, it certainly was a time when work was something to be admired, and the results of hard work, which were personal wealth, were not seen as something awful or evil that was just dropped on you by the wealth fairy, but as the natural result of leading a virtuous, self-disciplined life. And this is the natural outcome of what happens if you work your tail off and don't spend all your money. I think also, ladies and gentlemen, if we look at some of the values that have changed, we used to allow the Wright brothers to fail. Those kids failed when they were little boys, and so when they went back in 1900 and 1901 and 1902 and finally in 1903, and the kites were destroyed and there were swarms of mosquitoes and they were just barely hanging on, they'd been allowed to fail, and they understood the value of persistence. SpaceX and Bezos' company, a lot of rocket explosions to get to this point, you know? And if you don't let these snowflake fascists fail in little things, how can we expect them to succeed after the failures required to do big things? But there's one thing about that lost future also that I'd like to point out, and that's simply this. It was not a multicultural future. It was a multiracial future. It was a future that didn't make any distinctions on where you came from, what your nationality was, what your background was, what your religion was. It's a world of individual achievement where you were allowed to do what you wanted to do and reap your own rewards or lack of rewards. And that sense of individuality and that internal sense of virtue, I think, is the main reason we've lost this world of wonder that we could have had, despite some of the advances we've had in the toys that we use to walk as far away from discipline, hard work, and virtue as possible. In part 3, we'll take a look at the amazing world of government in that lost future, and what's most amazing about it is, well, you'll find out in the Members Only Part 3 segment. For Steve Green, Scott Ott, and the rest of the Trifecta crew, I'm Bill Whittle. Thanks for joining us.